What is really happening right now is not what most people think it is, and the deeper you look into this conflict, the more you realize that something far more significant is unfolding beneath the surface. Not simply a war between opposing military forces, but a complete transformation of modern warfare itself and a fundamental reshaping of the global power balance. Most of what you are seeing reported in mainstream coverage is the surface layer. The mechanisms driving this conflict, the calculations, the deliberate choices, the long-term strategic architecture, are almost entirely absent from public discussion. That is what this breaks down, clearly and completely. From the very beginning, Iran has communicated something important through its actions rather than its words. This is not about ending the conflict quickly. It never was. What Iran has been constructing from the earliest stages of this confrontation is a level of deterrence so comprehensive and so credible that no nation would consider repeating this scenario in the future. That objective changes the entire frame through which every development in this conflict must be understood. Because if the goal is long-term deterrence rather than short-term military victory, then every strike, every measured response, every deliberate pause carries a different meaning than conventional military analysis would assign to it. This is precisely why the situation appears contradictory on the surface. What looks like weakness from one analytical angle is frequently strategy. What appears to be escalation from another angle is often carefully calculated restraint. The gap between what is visible and what is actually occurring is where mainstream analysis consistently fails, and where the most consequential dynamics of this conflict are playing out. When examining the effectiveness of U.S. and allied operations, the official narrative emphasizes overwhelming success, massive destruction of missile systems, severe degradation of Iran's military capabilities, decisive results achieved at scale. But the reality on the ground presents a considerably more complicated picture, and the complications matter enormously for understanding where this conflict is heading. The number of missiles being launched has decreased significantly. That much is accurate. But a reduction in launch volume does not automatically indicate a loss of capability. In fact, the evidence on the ground suggests something quite different, a deliberate strategic shift toward precision warfare. Fewer missiles are being used, but each one is being selected with far greater care, calibrated to maximize impact against specific high-value targets. This is supported directly by what analysts are observing in the field, where targets are being struck with increasing accuracy and with effects that directly contradict the earlier assessment that Iranian systems lack meaningful precision. In modern warfare, precision matters far more than quantity. A single accurate strike achieves what dozens of inaccurate ones cannot. A missile that hits exactly what it is aimed at changes the battlefield equation in ways that volume alone never could. The shift from mass launches to targeted precision operations is not a sign of desperation, it is a sign of adaptation. And adaptation of this kind, executed under active combat conditions, reflects a level of military planning that significantly exceeds what many analysts initially projected. There is a deeper layer to this that demands serious consideration. The early phase of this conflict, the period of high-volume launches, may have been designed specifically to exhaust defensive systems rather than to destroy targets directly. When large numbers of missiles are launched, air defense networks are forced to respond to each one. Every interception consumes a physical interceptor missile from a finite stockpile. Those stockpiles are not unlimited. They cannot be replenished instantly. And once those defensive resources begin to deplete, the protective shield weakens, creating windows of vulnerability that can be exploited by more precise, more carefully timed strikes in a subsequent phase. If this was indeed the underlying design, then what the world is observing now is not a weakened Iran struggling to maintain its offensive capacity. It is the opening of a second phase, one where efficiency has replaced volume, where every action is planned with surgical precision, and where the groundwork laid in the first phase is now being converted into operational advantage. This interpretation is not speculative. It is supported by the trajectory of events on the ground, and it demands a fundamental reassessment of how this conflict is being evaluated. Alongside the physical battlefield, there is a second dimension of this conflict that receives almost no serious attention in mainstream coverage, the psychological dimension. War is not fought only on the ground or in the air. It is fought simultaneously in the minds of decision-makers, military planners, and entire populations. And Iran has demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of this reality. By maintaining a credible and demonstrated ability to strike, while visibly choosing not to exercise that ability at full capacity, Iran generates something more powerful than any single missile strike. It generates uncertainty. And uncertainty in modern strategic conflict is among the most potent weapons available. Uncertainty forces an opponent to prepare simultaneously for multiple scenarios. It stretches resources across a broader defensive posture. It increases the cognitive and logistical burden on military planners. It complicates strategic decision-making at every level. And it does all of this continuously, without expending a single additional weapon. This psychological pressure is amplified considerably by one critical fact. There is no credible evidence that Iran is running out of weapons. Most independent estimates suggest Iran began this conflict with a stockpile substantially larger than what has been deployed so far. The perception of depletion, which has been presented in several official assessments, may be precisely that, a perception, and one that serves Iran's strategic interests by encouraging the opponent to underestimate what remains available. As this conflict continues to evolve, a clear transition is becoming visible in how Iran is conducting its operations. The shift is from reactive warfare to proactive strategy. Earlier in the conflict, responses followed a pattern tied closely to what had just occurred. Action, reaction, response. What is emerging now is a different model entirely, one driven by real-time intelligence rather than immediate retaliation. Iran is relying increasingly on surveillance data, drone reconnaissance, and satellite imagery to assess damage from previous strikes, identify new vulnerabilities, and select targets based on current conditions rather than predetermined lists. This represents a fundamentally different operational posture, one that prioritizes accuracy of information over speed of response, and that selects targets based on maximum strategic effect rather than symbolic retaliation. The level of coordination this requires points to a command structure that is not merely surviving under pressure, but actively adapting to it in real time, which again challenges the dominant narrative of a military apparatus in decline. Perhaps the most consequential aspect of the current situation is what has not yet happened, because there are clear indicators that Iran is deliberately holding back significant capabilities, maintaining them in reserve while observing how events develop. This introduces a dimension of danger that extends well beyond the current exchange of strikes. If specific red lines are crossed, and several of those lines have been identified in the context of energy infrastructure across the Gulf, the response that follows could be of a scale and intensity that substantially exceeds anything observed so far. The energy infrastructure of the Gulf region remains one of the most strategically valuable and simultaneously most vulnerable targets in the world. A large-scale coordinated strike against that infrastructure would not be a regional event. The consequences would propagate globally within days, disrupting oil supply, driving energy prices across multiple markets, and creating economic instability across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Countries with no direct involvement in this conflict, but with deep dependency on stable Gulf energy flows, would face immediate and severe economic consequences. This is what makes the conflict's trajectory so critical to understand, and so dangerous to misread. The discussions emerging around potential ground operations reveal another major shift in the nature of modern warfare, one that makes traditional military strategies considerably more difficult to execute than historical precedent would suggest. The widespread deployment of surveillance systems and combat drones has fundamentally altered the risk calculation for large troop deployments. Movements that would previously have gone undetected for critical hours are now identified and potentially targeted within minutes. Traditional formation-based military operations face a level of real-time observational pressure that simply did not exist in previous conflicts. Even the most powerful and well-equipped armies face significant operational challenges in environments where surveillance is constant and drone engagement can occur at any point along a route of advance. This reality affects both sides of this conflict, and it means that the armies best positioned to succeed in this environment are not necessarily the largest or the most conventionally powerful, but the ones that have adapted most effectively to the new conditions of modern warfare. Decentralized, drone-integrated, intelligence-driven operations that reduce exposure and maximize precision. This conflict is not occurring in isolation. Its effects are already influencing global alliances, reshaping strategic calculations in capitals far from the Middle East, and accelerating economic pressures that were already present before the first strike was launched. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of this broader picture. As a choke point for global energy supply, even the credible threat of disruption, let alone actual disruption, carries consequences that ripple through commodity markets, shipping insurance rates, and energy policy decisions across multiple continents. Iran retains multiple mechanisms to exert pressure in this area, from drone and missile capabilities to naval tactics capable of constraining or controlling maritime traffic. The result is a state of sustained tension that affects global markets and high-level decision-making continuously, regardless of whether a specific military action occurs on any given day. As energy prices fluctuate and supply chains become more exposed to disruption risk, the economic footprint of this conflict expands well beyond the parties directly engaged in it. This is the interconnected nature of modern geopolitics, where a conflict concentrated in one region carries real and immediate consequences for economies that have no involvement in the fighting, but are structurally dependent on what that region produces and exports. At the deepest level, the most significant problem is not the conflict itself. It is the absence of a clear, defined, long-term strategy for resolving it. Without a coherent objective, one that goes beyond the immediate military exchange and addresses the structural conditions that produce this confrontation, every action risks becoming reactive rather than purposeful. History has demonstrated consistently that conflicts without clearly defined strategic endpoints tend to extend far beyond initial projections, accumulate damage that was never part of any plan, and generate consequences that no party to the original conflict anticipated or desired. Any resolution that has a realistic chance of holding would need to address not merely the immediate military situation, but the underlying tensions and competing strategic interests that generated this confrontation in the first place. That is a vastly more complex undertaking than negotiating a ceasefire. It requires a different kind of political will, a different kind of diplomatic architecture, and a willingness from all parties to engage with long-term consequences rather than short-term positions. What is becoming increasingly clear as this conflict continues is that the global balance of power is shifting, and this confrontation is accelerating that shift in ways that are not yet fully visible or fully understood. New realities about military capability, strategic planning, and geopolitical influence are being established in real time, and the lessons being drawn from this conflict will shape how nations build their militaries, structure their alliances, and calculate their risks for years and possibly decades to come. The question is no longer simply who wins or loses this particular confrontation. The question is what the world looks like when it is over, and whether the alliances, institutions, and strategic frameworks that have defined global politics for the past several decades will emerge intact or be replaced by something fundamentally different.